Yeah, it's our pleasure today to invite Prof. Jerry Dennerline to give us the talk entitled Discussion of Methods and Sources for a book entitled Between Heaven and Earth, Learning, Faith, Power, and Performance in the Chinese Community of Malacca, 1795 to 1945. Let me give a brief introduction of Prof. Jerry. Prof. Jerry Dennerline is the Emeritus Professor of History and Asian Studies, Amherst College. His research focuses on local social and cultural history, including intellectual, religious, and political cross-currents, drawing on Chinese documents, oral history, interviews, memoirs, and historical periodicals. For the past 20 years, he has focused on the local and trans-local Chinese communities in the British Straits settlements of Malacca, Singapore, and Penang. And his book, the Chia-ting Loyalists, Confucius Leadership and Social Change in 17th Century China, and Qian Mu, The World of Seven Mansions, both were published by Yale University and were also translated into Mandarin, into Chinese. And he also published several articles on local and family history in the Lower Yangzi region between the 16th and 20th century. At the same time, if we search online, we actually read quite a few articles on his writing on Malacca. So without further ado, let us invite Prof. Jerry. The floor is.
Thank you very much. Is this all right? We got sound? Okay. And of course, I want to begin by thanking everybody who's been helpful. And I've come here with, I hope we have people who were listening to Margaret a little while ago, and I want to be doing things similar to her. But I also want to begin by thanking people, and she'd be the first person I thank because she's the one who brought me to Malacca 20 years ago. And I've been sticking out there in the summers ever since. And I want to thank Professor Dr. Danny Wong for hosting us here. And also Professor Dr. David Yu and other people who have been a great help. And I also mentioned, as Margaret did, Professor K, that is Paul Kratoska, who I regard, and he may be surprised, but I regard him as one of my mentors because of some fine work he did on tax law and things like that, property laws in Malacca. So with that, I guess I should begin by saying, just having a look at what I've just put up on the screen in front of you. This is title of a book. The manuscript is all finished. It will forever be revised, I hope, but I want to discuss the methods and sources that I have used in this book. And it's together on this picture with two maps, and you might just try to think about what the maps mean and what the title means while I go into this little soliloquy on why I'm here and what I'm doing. So I'd like to say first about what this book is and what it is not. And so let me start with what it is not. It's not a history of British colonial Malacca. You see the dates, 1795 to 1945, but it's not a history of colonial Malacca. It's not a general history of Malacca, either the state or the city. As you can see by the small map, I'm looking at the center of the city as the focus of the study. It's not a background history for Malaysia or Malaysian Chinese today. That is, it's about Chinese in Malacca. Finally, it will conclude with an epilogue related to the present, but it's not intended to address the complex issues of independence and transition to a post-colonial society. So it's history. I live in the past. And my sources are very much in the past, but I will also, when I get to sources, explain how I got up to a lot of those sources from people in the present. Now, that's what the book isn't. And so let's think about what it is. It's, well, why Malacca? You know, I mean, I'm not from Malacca, I'm not Chinese, but Malacca is it's my choice by serendipity. And I found that in my whole career, I find the most interesting things to do because of serendipity. That is, I'm a historian. I can't help but be a historian. And Margaret said that sometimes it's useful to her, and I can't help it. So the next thing is that Margaret brought me here 20 years ago, as I said. And so for 20 years, this historian, who's been sitting in Malacca over the summers, I've devoted all this time to reading and collecting local knowledge. Now, more about that later. But then the second thing is there a need for such a book? And I think there's a great need for this book, because there's been so much search on very particular aspects of things. Malacca is often mentioned. There's some very great studies of this and that in Malacca, but there really is nothing comparable to what I want to do here. That is the community, the Chinese community as a whole. And so then, well, why the Chinese community? And I say community because, first of all, there was a Chinese community here in 1795, and it wasn't just a collection of sojourners. So the point is, this is not just a study of diaspora. It's not a study of all the different dialect groups and so on separately, but it's a study of a community and sort of how I can see this community developing over time. So then the next thing I guess I would say about the community, it says, I was trained as a historian of China, and I always did local historical studies, not great grand studies, but local historical studies. And sometimes historians refer to two types of historians. There are the parachutists and the truffle hunters. And I'm more of a truffle hunter, but because I really just look to discover what's there on the earth. But the point is that I've always done local histories. And what you do is you find things that keep leading you deeper and deeper into that local history instead of starting to imagine what it is more generally. So that's where I started. Now, using local sources and focusing on social and cultural aspects, connecting them with broader political and intellectual stories. So we start with the local and then reach out to how it reaches out to the global. Now, I guess maybe on sources, I've got a slide. So why don't I see if I can make this thing work and go down to the next slide. See, it didn't work already. What was it? Oh, I have to go down. I have to go. There it is. Okay. So here's something about sources. And I would first acknowledge the local knowledge. These are oral sources, interviews, school, temple, church, publications, informants, visits, and so on that I've been doing over 20 years. And that kind of source is so essential to this because it's only by discussing with people what they know and what they don't know that I get access to things that I didn't know. And so we learn from each other in these conversations, and then they become interviews when you learn more. And so many of these sources are really, local knowledge is really about oral sources that lead you to something which is more of a textual nature. And so I have dozens of friends in Malacca who have brought me things about schools, about churches, about individuals and institutions that I can then explore more deeply. And with that local knowledge comes local understanding of what they are and mean, but not all of it necessarily historically based. But okay, well then the next thing is a very important collection, which is Chinese epigraphic materials in Malaysia. There's a lot of epigraphic material in Malacca, as some here will probably know. That material is not accessible to everybody. So, and if you, that is to say, if you want to use this material, you really have to spend a lot of time researching and going back and forth and going from document to document. But you find it very rewarding because it can help you to connect people to other people. You find generations connected. You find who's funding what over the entire period from 1795 to 1945. And this is a point for especially the early part of this history, because in the early part of the history, you have very little active voice, but you have a lot of epigraphic material, right? So then we have more recently, and this is crucial, the National Library Board, the digitized newspaper collection. This is in Singapore, and every newspaper is now available as an e-resource. So when people like me, as old as I am, you plan your research, you've got your questions, and you know where you have to go, and you spend everything you've got and get funding, and you go to that place and you sit in that archive and you read that thing with those questions in your mind. And once you've left, you're done. You can't come back, you know, like tomorrow afternoon if you've already left the place. And these things can be anywhere in the world. And I've found them in Japan, I've found them in New York, I've found them in Taiwan, I've found them in China, and so on. But with this particular collection, I can sit during the pandemic for 4 years and look out my window, whether it's snowing or the sun is shining, and I can ask another question that I didn't think of last week. So this is where the serendipity aspect comes in, that it's very important to find voices in these newspapers when you have something else to connect the voices to. And then you can search again, and then you have more sources, right? Then there are many other things. The Latbao is available as a Chinese newspaper. Well, there's also, you know, English or Chinese, you get the Latbao is the newspaper, the first newspaper in Singapore, and it's available at NUS. Now, then we come to Genie.com, and Genie.com is not necessarily always accurate, of course, but when you have it and you can connect things you find about particular families who are interested in sort of posting things and connecting, you find the connections that you can then validate from somewhere else. These are extremely valuable when it comes to looking back at the epigraphic material, for example, that you can connect them. The Malacca Guardian, 1930, well, I said 1935. The Malacca Guardian, the years that it was published between 1928, I think, and 42, is such a valuable resource because once you've got a thread of something going, and this is how I first got into the research, I think, was I was looking in 1933 because of this thing called the Wanghang procession. And so in 1933, I started reading Malacca Guardian day by day to see what sort of other things were going on. And then I started getting connections to all sorts of things. And that got me involved in the next item, which is Peifang Zhongxue, the Peifang Middle School, and their publications and their teachers, and their one of their primary people was Sim Mo Yu, again, back to local knowledge. So following these, then Paul Kotaska comes up in the Malacca, the Transformation Malay Capital, that incredible collection of research way back in the 1970s and 80s. So I put it on here as a primary source, not quite. And then here are these other things, which I won't have to read them all off to you, but there they are. The last item on this list has to do with the last item that we'll try to get to in the epilogue, which is the Intangible Cultural Heritage Award, Safeguard, which was given to the Wanghang Festival in Malacca in 2019, and then they had their festival in 2020, and that's a very long story. Okay, now we don't need to look at all this, but if you will, that's sort of it. Now the methods in this book I refer to, we come to the map. The methods, I decided, the title indicates it, that I would try to write narratives that would cover a good bit of time on the different topics. So the first one is, first I put in a landscape, and then there's a chapter on learning, a chapter on faith, a chapter on power. And I thought that was going to be it. But as I was writing it, I realized I had to have a chapter on performance, because in every one of these things, one of the key aspects of learning, faith, power is the performance of all of them. And so that is chapter 5. And then that's followed by the future. Now this is 30s and what was happening in the Chinese community. And so at that time, my internet connection is unstable, they're telling me now. So anyway, by the 1920s and 30s, we can see all these different threads coming together and working in a variety of ways throughout the Chinese community. And that's what I intended to do with it. Now, so the method involves these 4 narratives now, 4 themes. And then what I've discovered by trying to write these themes on the basis of research that I had done and more research I was doing. And that is that the more I worked at telling these stories, and I said the performative aspect is important, but even things like, so you look at political rituals, you look at schools, temples, processions, you look at music, you look at sports, and then finally debating, and you find out, and debating is a very, very important thing, and the writing, the rhetoric in newspapers and so on is an important part of performing, the performativity of this community. And it's really delightful way of entering it. And so all of these things then lead to, over time, they say, well, I'll read it. It says, well, first, and then yes, all these things happen. And they, ultimately, the goal is to show how generation by generation over this long period of time, the culture changed. And each of the aspects changed. Learning became something else. Faith involved more. The performance in the faith world became fantastic by the Wangkang in 1933. And it also has to do with power because all the money goes into it. So these things coming together, the point is that a community of Chinese in Malacca was forming and reforming and revising itself under the conditions that included the British government. And under those conditions, we find a remarkable amount of integration, generation by generation, of the different groups of Chinese in Malacca. So that said, I think I will try to get real about this thing and go back to this way. And just notice now, the first chapter is about landscape. So the question is, here, this central part of Malacca, what do you see in the landscape? And so I would say, of course, we want to know, well, who's governing this place? But then we notice that the first important item on this particular map right here is actually Bukit Chino. That is to say, in 1795, the first thing that this Chinese community did, and remember in 1795, the Dutch East India Company dissolved, and Holland was being invaded by Napoleon. And so it's not British territory yet, but the British are in charge. And the Chinese community know very well that something big is going on in the world and they've got to do something about it. And the very first thing they did was they put that little pavilion up at the Posanteng at Bukit Chino, and they're protecting that cemetery. This theme runs all the way through to the 21st century, by the way. And it's important because it relates to everything else. Now, the second thing would be the Chenghunteng, which is, I don't know, can I point? I can't use a pointer. You'll find the Chenghunteng, oh, there it is, on this map. But you'll notice that across from the Chenghunteng is not a chapel. There is a chapel. It's not the stage that we know today. It's the mission chapel. Now, if we go on here, we see here is the Chenghunteng, and here is that beautiful stage across from it, where I understand they're having a keroncong performance tomorrow. It's a very, very active. it's a central place in this community, in Malacca in general. But in 1826, it was the mission chapel for the London Missionary Society. So the story that the first chapter begins with is, how do we get this stage on the place of the chapel? And then that works as a bracket for everything else that is in the landscape, right? You notice the Anglo-Chinese College down there in the corner, and so on. Now, so that's by way of introducing that, what's in that first chapter. But in addition to it, we have stories of, and here's the thing. Remember that the state of Malacca, well, at this time, you know, the British didn't really control this thing. Here's this whole area called Nanning, which was the Minangkabau people, who are about to have an uprising against the British because, you know, the British want to rearrange their arrangements with the land. They want to collect tax. They want to overcome the customary laws of Malay people out there. And so who has to intervene to, like, sort of calm things down but the Dutch burghers? And so Dutch burghers and this Chinese community are at that point interacting to help protect the British for their territory. And it's sort of, the story I'm sure many of us know. I also want us to notice on this map that down there in the right-hand corner is the place called Kandang. And it's not in the city. It's pretty far out, but that's going to play in the chapter on faith and down to the present with the, right. Now, the last thing that happens in setting the landscape is the story of the Nonias. And in speaking to various people, we play with the idea that maybe, you know, they shouldn't be called Baba Nonias, they should be called Nonya Babas, because the Nonias are actually the key people in the very beginning of this community. Here is a particular grid of some of the great families, which you can't see, we have time to look at the detail in, but the point is the way in which they were intermarried and where they came from. Most of these families had nonias, that is the mothers and daughters, sisters, were, you know, they were the children of nonias, who were the children of nonias. That is, they're third generation nonias, which mean they are Malacca domiciled Chinese women. And they're speaking, of course, what we call Baba Malay. But the men that they married in this particular time, between the 1750s and 1790s, these men were usually 15 to 20 years older, sometimes 30 years older, and they had to marry nonias in Malacca if they were going to have families, and then those children of those nonias are going to be supporting them and so on. So this was not a sojourning society, really, because it was a local society that the men were sort of moving, some were moving out of, and some were not. But those who stayed were, of course, the sons of these nonias. And if you follow the marriages that happen over the next 2 or 3 generations, you see it's those nonia, the nonias in those families are kind of making the connections between in the community that were so important. So this is part of that story. And we don't have time for the details, but it gets this complicated in the first 2 or 3 generations. Now, this one I have to just rush through. The King Teck-Hui in Singapore was built in 1831. These people are all from, these are the men from Malacca who were in Singapore when a lot of things were unstable. Part of the instability was because of Nanning, which was rebelling, and the degree that the British did not really have control. So they set up the King Teck-Hui to protect, and they're connected to the Cheng Hun Teng and to the cemetery, these same people. Then there are in Malacca, there's the Malay chiefs, the tin mines, the Hakas are moving into the Kongsi and so on. And these people in the King Teck-Hui are going to be the sort of elite families that are going to protect their families back in Malacca. The families back in Malacca, and this is what they're doing in Singapore, but the families back in Malacca were now moving into Herod Street by the 1840s, and these are, of course, the Nonias families. Now, I don't have time for all this, but this is this is a well-known painting you might know of the three Malacca boys who ended up meeting the Queen in England because the missionaries ran away. So when the missionaries left, here they left this little temple. This is a modern version of it, but this little temple in Kandang that was one of the places where they had schools. The schools were no longer there after that. And so these stories of what's going on in Singapore, what's going on in the small towns in Malacca are all interrelated. And that's the social background. Okay, so that's the landscape. Then learning, this is not about learning, but you can imagine how many kinds of learning. So in this chapter, we're dealing with the Chinese texts, the Confucian learning. We're also dealing with the liberal empire idea of learning, and we're dealing with the missionaries' idea of learning, and we're looking at where the schools were and who was learning in them. And this chapter begins with the story of Tan Hongxiang's orchid. You may be aware of Tan Hongxiang's orchid, named after his father, Tan Chia-ting. It won first prize in the Chelsea Flower Show in London in 1954. So if you want to know how on earth did some guy in Malacca, from Malacca, get involved in developing an orchid to show in the orchid category in the Chelsea Flower Show in 1954, and why did he do it and name it after his father? All I have to do is say that, and some of you who are familiar with the genealogy will know that goes back to Tan Chia-ting, who planted the rubber in Malacca, which goes back to Tan Tek Guan, who was the first sort of person interested in botany, who helped to seed that rubber industry. So the learning that began, very practical learning, both the mission schools and the liberal idea of empire and the Chinese education, all working in this society. And I wanted to say how that happened. So now, anyway, so we go on, and this is going to end with the Chinese schools, which we will get to the details on later. Because Tan Chia-ting was one of the coalition of people that helped to build the Peifang schools, the first Mandarin schools in Malacca. Now the next chapter is faith, and we have to go back to that temple in Kandang, because all of the aspects of the ritual life in all the temples in Malacca were under the authority, at least on paper, of the Chenghun-teng. So the Chenghun-teng had this role. They owned the properties of these temples. And then along came the Ongyas, and that is the Kandang temple is of a particular type of Chinese folk religion called the worship of the Ongyas. And this has its story starting from 1847. And I have devoted quite a bit of time to the detail of that. So we need to start thinking about what religions are actually Chinese. And because then by the time we get to the 20th century, many Chinese are also becoming Christians. So the stories, the thing is, the stories around these things, the individuals involved in them are what become, I think, particularly interesting. The fourth chapter is on power, and that chapter begins with August 5th, 1914. You got some sense of August 5th, 1914? It is when the British finally had to declare war on Germany for the First World War began. The very next morning, the Chinese held meetings in two places, and over the next few days, they held meetings all over Malacca. The first meetings were at the club of the rubber corporations, because by 1914, the rubber industry was the power center of Malacca, and the population had doubled in 10 years, and the Chinese were all a major part of this. So in the power chapter, we want to say, why is it? How did the community coalesce so quickly on the day after the war was declared? And why was Tan Cheng Lock chosen to be the spokesman for that community? He's speaking for the rubber industry, and they took the rubber industry took, the rubber planters took their plans to the Chengonteng Temple. And then the Chengonteng Temple had a meeting of hundreds of Chinese citizens, and they decided to elect a committee to go back and form the policy for dealing with the government as it went to war in Europe. It's a very important moment that is rarely attended to in the general histories, but this is when Tan Cheng Lock appeared as definitely the most important political figure. And he had already made his name in the rubber industry. So the power chapter is going to go back and look at, well, what was happening in Malacca with the Chinese community dealing with the British all these previous decades. And so there's stories of near uprisings, there's stories of police overacting, there's stories of fights going on between different Kongxi, and there's a story of a really big story in the 1880s about who owns the land and who has the right to titles and who has the best lawyers in Singapore. And so that story involves a good use of the law to challenge the government's attempt to make claims against the Chinese, some Chinese property owners whose names will be familiar to us by now because they appear in the previous chapters. All right, this is the background for dealing with the state. Now, the next chapter is about performance, but here you see are some photos. Here is Tan Cheng Lock early on as a leader in the rubber industry and at home in the 30s. We don't really need to see all those pictures, but here he is again, and here, and here is at the end of this story, we're going to get to the founding of the first Mandarin school, the Peifeng schools. But we got to take a little break to look at performance, because here are the stories in this chapter. A lot of it depended on my discoveries in the newspaper called the Malacca Weekly Chronicle. The Malacca Weekly Chronicle is not a newspaper you see referred to very often, but now it's there in the Singapore digitized collection, and you go back and look at it, and it's for 2 years, 104 issues, Malacca in 1988 and 89. It's got like everything that's going on. So the delightful thing is that you have a lot of stuff about performance in there. And I would point to, you know, who made the music, and how do we know who made the music, and who liked the music and who didn't like the music, and who came, or what kind of, what do they do for entertainment? What about sport? And you find, you know, there's a lot about trying to develop sports in various categories. The British were doing it. The Chinese were beginning to do it. What did they do for entertainment? Well, there's traveling shows coming from out of town. The Bangsawan is being invented. You know which kinds of Chinese operas were popular and where they performed. You find out well, what a performance a funeral could be, and a burial could be, and how big the processions were, and what the Westerners who were viewing it think of it. It's like a huge, you know, retreat because somebody died, and these sorts of things show that sort of it's the colorful stuff about what goes on in performing. But there's one very interesting person and thing here. There was a debating society, a debate society, which was created by sort of bored Englishmen who said we have to have something for entertainment. And so the very first topic for debate was, which is worse? Wait a minute, if I could find the reference. Which is worse? Something like a sentence of 2 years in jail, or 3 months assignment to Malacca, the Sleepy Hollow, all right? And so they're making whimsy of it. Pretty soon, Tan Cheng Lock, the very articulate Tan Cheng Lok, became a member of the debating society. And within a couple of months, they were debating opium, should it be prohibited? They were debating how prostitution works. They were debating, should you have, and he's citing Confucius in his arguments. So to see that voice, very articulate right there in the debate society, it tells us something about that aspect of performance. And it's kind of whimsical, political, but one of the the humor writers for the newspaper was very happy to say that, well, now it looks like the debate society will probably become the future government of Malacca, making a joke, right? So we keep our eye on that aspect of the culture and move into the last two chapters, which deal with the 1920s and 30s. So by the time we get to 20s and 30s, you can see the development of the theatrical world, the schools competing, the sports programs, and so on. But if we come back to the Chinese Mandarin school, now here we have on the screen, in 1913, there was Tan Chien, who was the sort of most prominent Baba in the community. There was Sim Hong Pak, who was a native of Trenzhou, and he had migrated to Malacca as a lad, working with his brother, who was married already to the daughter of Chan Kung Sui, who was later recognized as the most prominent philanthropical citizen of Malacca. So this was a coalition that included Hainanese, Hakka, and Hokkien, and Baba, and the committee that set it up was this very integrated committee of Chinese, and it was probably the very first actual Chinese school in the Straits that was teaching with Mandarin rather than one of the dialects. It was very conscious of that. And so the teachers who came to this school were all from China, and they were part of New Culture movement and so on. So these were the highly educated people out there. They become essentially like New Culture missionaries in the diasporic world. And they came directly to Malacca. They're teaching in the school. If anybody knows, for example, Wang Gungwu in the Straits in Singapore and Malacca, a very prominent commentary historian, his father was first employed in Malaysia by coming to Malacca to teach in this school, the Peifang School. And as they developed, I don't have time to go into those details. Here's a Peifang graduation in 1922, looking a lot like a graduation picture from, SFI or the high school or someplace. But now one of the people who was involved in the 1930s as a major figure was this fellow, Ho Baojian, or He Baoren. And he ended up in Malacca for various family reasons I won't go into, but he had been actually the leader, the president of the All Shanghai Student Union that went on strike in the May 4th movement in 1919 in China. And that's what he was as a student. And this picture over here of the junior class shows you what even the Chinese historians had never mentioned, that this is the entire junior class of Fudan University. It was so young, it only had 2 classes. This was the junior class, and there they are, all of them. And He Baoren was one. So he came back by the 1930s, and he was the director of the schools, the Peifang school system, and a very, very active and important member of this community in Malacca. So moving on then, eventually to, here's the entertainment world. This is part of the entertainment world in the 30s, to realize the Wong Kong procession was not just a religious festival. It was a huge spectacular and entertainment. You see behind it in this photo, the Capitol Theater it's going in front of. Well, this very same year, the Capitol Theater was judged by the what's his name? The Siamese prince Charaputra, who was the kind of the expert, the aficionado expert on state of the film industry at the time. He dubbed this to have the best sound system in all of the Straits. This is the Capitol Theater, 1933, and it's the first. It's showing color films and all this kind of stuff from. While this is going on in front of it, and meanwhile, the Zhongchen Society over here on the left is having this is its arts and drama group. So the dramatic productions and musical productions and religious festivals are all part of the same wonderful entertainment industry, but they're also a statement about the Chinese really claiming the city. This is their city and they have made it and they are on their way to the future, whatever is going to happen. And you see here in this photo on the left, Sim Hong Pak and Ho Pa Jin are both members of this drama society group. And here are some, this is a cartoon from the Malacca Guardian about the noise. Here are the other things that are going on in the newspapers in 1933 and 4 and 5 about what's going on in the entertainment world. And here is Yankee Leung, the cartoonist for the Guardian, making jokes about the Hong Kong Festival. And other people say, hey, what about us? This is just the Chinese. Now this one, a photo, is of the Zhongchen Society. And we want to pay attention to what's going on here. The building we want to remember, because right now that building is endangered. And I hope that somebody will find a way to keep it from going down the tubes and will save the Zhongchen Society headquarters, because this was the center of the Chinese community in the 1930s, no question about it. Here's the band that was at the foot of that picture. And this is Audrey's contribution, I do believe. And you also see this famous Ho Pa Jin right there in the center of this picture behind the drum as a sponsor of this thing. And then there are these articles all over the newspaper about the Zhongchen Society. Here are the office bearers being. Here is a letter that was sent that Ho Pa Jin wrote to China to get a library from Shanghai, which was a standard library that could be made and sent out to schools and communities. And he ordered this directly from Shanghai and got a discount on it so that Malacca people would have this library. And it was in the Zhongchen Society. Here's the ladies section was introduced, and the newspaper calls this the premier, you know, this is really great, the premier social institution in Malacca. And here is Audrey Lim's auntie, who was the first elected president of that ladies' union. And here they are putting on shows. This Ahmed the Cobbler thing was actually performed by at the Zhongchen Society. And here's another wonderful band picture. So this also happened at the Zhongchen Society. The Fudan University volleyball team came. They were champions in China. They were traveling around in Japan, Philippines, and other places. They came to Malacca because, well, there's Ho Pa Jin from Fudan University, and here's the volleyball team. And this fellow who was the athletic leader, the athletic director at Fudan, was from Muar. He had gone to SFI and then off to Fudan. And now they're back visiting and they're showing off and they're playing basketball against the local teams. So this is what they were doing in the mid-1930s. Here is the political meeting. This is a new consul general in Singapore who has come to meet and greet with the Chinese community. And here he is at the Zhongchen Society where they are receiving him, standing there in the middle with various famous people. These are about the Sim family, and here's other Zhongchen things. These are Zhongchen things after the war, and here now we're in the period after the war. So this is the Sim Mu Calligraphy Museum where his son Bekti and his grandson Lim Sheng are showing off the genealogy of the hundreds and hundreds of descendants of the Sim family. Okay, how are we doing? We have any time? What should we do? Wong Kong procession. Here's the Wong Kong in 1933. There's the vessel, and here are the Chai Lians all dressed up waiting to go on parade. Here's the Chai Lian outfit. These now have become the signature of this festival. And of course, they're locally made, and the costumes were very important parts of this procession. Here they are in front of the Capitol. And here, this is the degree to which the Wong Kong procession had become basically a spectacular performance. And it was attended by people from all over the Straits. Huge crowds come down to watch this thing. The Malay community turned out in great numbers and sat on the hills and stuff to watch this procession go on. It went on for 2 days, you know. And so they're basically occupying the entire city. The police are being told, you know, you keep everybody under, do a better job of keeping everybody out of our Wong Kong procession. It was a magnificent procession. And the here it is going on. There is a 1919 version. All right. So one reason that it's so interesting to look at this is because here's another example of something, a living tradition, a tradition that seemed to die when the war was over, and we'll never see it again. And now we've got it as an intangible cultural heritage of Malacca. How'd that happen? Now that's a part of my history, right? That's part of the epilogue. And so we got to wonder, here is the UNESCO World Heritage Site core and buffer zones. The temple, Yongzhendian, is outside the buffer zone. It's not protected. But the intangible, here is what happens at the temple. Here is what happened in between 2005 and 2012. And they published these things. You notice on the left-hand bottom, that photo is announcing visits from the Jiading temple in the Jiading Ongya temple in Taiwan and the Brunei temple, sending delegations to visit the Yongzhendian. So there's a outreach again to a kind of diaspora, an Ongya diaspora. And they're published this book, and now they're on their way. They're going to get this thing. And in 2012, they've got a procession, and now we have the UNESCO Cultural Heritage map, and you can see where the procession is going and beyond the map, and so on. And here's a book published with very prominent people in it and all who they were. The Taiwanese experts on Ongya temples were here judging this thing, and they're from Taiwan because the Ongya there's hundreds and hundreds of Ongya temples in Taiwan, and they don't exist much of anywhere else. And this Malaysia festival is unique in the Straits. There was no other Ongya festival like this. So they've made the connection on who we are, and they're reaching back, and they're getting this input from Taiwan. But then eventually, what do? By 2019, the temple has got recognition with the People's Republic of China and the state of Malaysia for recognizing this as an intangible cultural heritage. And so there's quite an interesting story about how that could happen. Here it is in 2020, how it could happen. This feast was prepared. This is the Nonya dishes, 108 dish offering at this festival in 2020. Only problem was the city was locked down and they couldn't go out in the streets. So the send-off, they nonetheless had a send-off with the Taoist priests doing their job and the ship being burnt. So we're going to have another one in January. So this is stuff that's going in the epilogue of this book for right now. And it's also sort of a part of what I want to say about why this book is needed. In the local community, I think something that tells the long story of how before 1945, Chinese community was developing and who was doing it, under what conditions, in responses to what kind of challenges, and how they kept integrating and integrating instead of dividing and dividing. And then here is a something that is happening now, which is, you know, relevant. I mean, that history is there for all of us to see. And here is something that somebody's doing without really worrying about a history like this, but reproducing, reinventing this Wangkang tradition when the Baba Nonya community itself thought it had long since died. This photo is my last photo, and I'm showing it because this photo was taken just a week ago in Malacca, and you are seeing an empty, abandoned Seng Chong Society building. And it's 5 years until that would have a 100th anniversary. It's not for, you know, the voice of the historian from 100 years ago to be saying, you know, what's up with this? But I'm saying, what's up with this? You know, this is a sort of thing that can happen. And if for me, looking at it, I do not understand how a community that centered so much on this place in the 1930s can allow it to happen. So, you know, somebody has got to be thinking about it. And one of the reasons that I think that we need this book is just so that people will have some place where they can go and look and see if they have any question about something that's going on today. They might have a historical question, which they can then go back and research. Now, I guess the final thing I would say is what I want for this book is not to have, you know, it's not something to put on a CV. It's not something that I want to have published at some prestigious place and go on a shelf. This is supposed to be a work in progress. That is, I'm not writing about the history of 1945 to now. This is that old part of history. I live in that world. So this is rather something that I think should be a resource. So it should be open access. It should be available for people to ask questions about. You got a question, all you got to do is, you know, ask the question. You Google in the question, you go to an index, and you use your own, you know, good fortune and serendipity to find out new things. And that's the way you can have some connection to this particular period in the past. It's not the ancient past. You know, this is not the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries and why Malacca was so great. This is the people who are actually living in this town and making this city for a period of 150 years and how they did it and how they integrated it. And so anybody can change things. They can go in, they can find more, they can learn more, they can find new sources, they can do anything they want if it's available for them to use as a resource. And that is my goal. So with that, I'll quit.
Thank you. Yes. Now open for Q&A session. Yes, we have. Please introduce yourself.
Yes. Professor, interested of the Wangkang percussion. Wangkang percussion. My first question is when the Wangkang percussion is recorded in the official record. Is in any Dutch record talking about the Wangkang percussion or not? Wangkang percussion. Yeah, sorry, possession. Yeah, Wangkang possession. And just now you show us a lot of the photo about the 1933. The mean why 1933? Why this year they have a Wangkang percussion? And then I think you have another photo you say is a 1919, isn't it? The 1919 is it related to the Spanish flood at that time because they want to clear the everything or whatever. Just now you saw a photo, I think it's a 1919, but it's too fast. Yeah. That means the origin of the Wonggang possessions, and the why is the 1933. Yeah. Two questions. Thank you very much.
So the one thing that they said, if we look at this as just a huge sort of performance and not really a religious festival, then people would say, well, it happens once every 14 years. But why are they saying that? Happened in 1891, 1905, 1919, and again in 1933. Well, but every time that they did decide to do it, they say, well, look what happened. So in back when the temple was created, there was cholera epidemics, there were smallpox epidemics. And so and cholera in 1847, cholera, they didn't know what was causing it. So it's this grounds for people who are going to temples to look for safety, I mean, there was a shipload of pilgrims who had gone to the Middle East, had gone to Saudi Arabia, and come back to Penang with like 40 dead bodies on the boat. That's the sort of thing they're reacting to at that point. And and the missionaries who were still in Malacca in 1940, two of the main missionaries at the school, Anglo-Chinese school, died of cholera. Mostly, they're Chinese and Malays who are dying of cholera. So that's a good reason to understand how this thing begins when you've got the Ongyao sitting around in a shed somewhere, right? Later on, the other years are associated with, well, there were more smallpox in 1890. There were people claiming, they wanted to have before that, they wanted to have the thing every 5 years. And they said, well, it's getting too expensive and nothing happened. And then suddenly there was an outbreak of something and the demand came through and they had another one. So the 14-year thing is something, looking back on it, if you're just thinking of possession. But then in 1919, you had a huge pandemic, right? The influenza pandemic. In 1905, it's a little less clear, but there were outbreaks of things. And you can see it's also then a politically very unstable time. Like revolutions are beginning and lots of things like that happening had happened just shortly before that. So there's always a reason or an excuse to ask the Ongyas, what's up? Should we have a cleansing ceremony? And so that's going on. In 1933, all the newspaper just says, well, we all know what's going on now. So if we think of 1933, no, it's not an epidemic, but what's happening is the League of Nations has just collapsed. The Japanese have invaded Manchuria, and that's the reason for the collapse. Hitler has just risen, has taken power in Germany, and it's a very volatile, and we're trying to get out of a rubber slump of the rubber market. So it was depression and geopolitics that I would say, but I'm not the one who's saying, right? What do they say? The thing is that there were two aspects of this very interesting, that the English press is really big on saying this is a sign of faith, this is a sign of hope, we're all united around you, everybody everybody has their own faith, you then have to be your faith, but look what's going on, all the people are gathering. But of course the hotel owners are thinking, this is great tourism, and the and people in the street are having a huge party. So you can think about this as being a religious festival, but all of the associations, like 20-some associations in the city of Malacca, were all participating in this march. And then if you read the local paper, instead of just the memento that was produced, you see that they're arguing about this and that, and who gets to do this and who gets to do that, and why are they so exclusive, and why are the boys actually old men flirting with the girls and everything. I mean, it's just all this stuff going on in the street. But so it was a spectacular, but it was also a claiming of the city streets for Chinese people in a way. And so I think you can just read any of those things into it. It was time. It was time. We had to have one of these. Does that sound? That's ridiculous. How am I saying that? You're going to go back and ask them. Sorry. There was a question. Yeah. Okay, if I can see it. This one? Yeah. 6, this and this. Yeah. Well, the question, I'm sorry. The question is, according to your research, have you found any connections between Malacca Chinese and the PRC ROC governments? And how do those Chinese leaders solve those relations? Well, yes. I mean, I think the Hong Kong effort is an interesting example of how things can work. That is, it's not a governmental connection when the temple, gets connections with temples in Taiwan. The governmental connection came with the PRC, and it was because of the progress in certain directions in China as well as here, and that was getting this cultural heritage protection. So the listing for safeguarding of an intangible cultural heritage is not easy to get, and there's a longer and longer list. It was just invented back in 2006 or 8 or something like that. And so China has been looking at its what it called superstition. That is the common religion of people all over the place, locally. And this superstition was not religion. So the 5 major religions, right? The 5 religions that are official in China did not include all this folk activity. So they decided in the 20th century, and finally getting there by 2015 or so, that they would reclassify these things as cultural activities of the local people and something this and that and the other. But what it means is they're setting up a separate category for these so-called communal temples, and the communal temples then will be able to own property, but they also will have to pay taxes and be regulated. So that is going on in China at exactly the same time that the Yongchen has been trying for some time to get recognition for the festival. Now, if you have a joint application, as I understand these things, I'm not an expert on, but if you had a joint application, 2 countries, and you have different classes of people, and you can say that it has something to do with the sea, then each one of these things knocks it up in the queue toward the top. And they did all those things, and then they got this sponsorship. So the application was made with the Cultural Ministry of Malaysia writing in Malay, and the Chinese Ministry, Cultural Ministry, writing in Chinese, and then both of them being translated into English, and they're claiming the common heritage. So that's the way that worked. It was bottom up, but taking advantage of United Nations opportunity, and then activating the governments in that case. As for other things about relations, yes, there's lots of things going on, but that's not what I actually do.
Can I ask a question? Prof. Jerry, I'm here.
Yeah. I was looking.
You're reading it.
Yeah.
Would you like to answer that? No. Can I just ask you a question?
Yes.
In your discussion, we seem to get an impression that the Chinese in Malacca seems to be one. Obviously, they are not, right? So, but then the impression that we get is that you talk of them as though they are one, but obviously they are not. But my question is that you showcase a group of Straits Chinese.
Yes.
You also showcase a group of Chinese educated from China.
Yes.
So the Peifeng group and also the say the Chenzhong group and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously they are very different. They were very different. And were they working together?
Yes.
In what way that they work together?
They're working together in these various ways. See, this is, how do these groups get integrated, right? When the British government decided they would allow plantations to be leased, and that's all, Paul Kotaska can tell you a lot about that, but also you read in these newspapers how that was working. So somebody like Chan Kung Sui, right? He is a dominant figure. And you think Chan Kung Sui is a dominant figure. He's born in Malacca, but his father was not. So he's Straits born, but he's not Baba. And he's a plantation developer, right? And he then is recruiting people to come with family connections or whatever from China. But these people come and they're not sojourners. They don't become sojourners. They're basically, their connections back with families back home are not the primary interest. They now have this tremendous interest in the local place. So they're coming, and it's plantation economy. So they're engaging in the same plantation economy as at the Babas are. And it's just like when the Babas were dealing with the Dutch burghers, they're working in the same economy, right? So if we think of it as a political economy, it's a sub-political economy dealing with the politics. And because Malacca, I mean, this is my reading of it, because Malacca was this old city, we're interested in that, but there's the whole, periphery out there. And so these are the people, even like Qi, for example, who was the, very important president of the Chenghontang. He had, interests and properties all over Malacca, in various places in Malacca, which he had engaged with the Dutch to get as his property to develop. So he was being a developer in Malacca. At the same time, he was trading he was a tin trader up in Rembo or someplace. So these people doing that kind of work are naturally engaging both with the labor that's coming in Kongsi, in Hakka Kongsi, and with with other immigrants that are coming and running the shops and so on. And because it's not Singapore or Penang, they're not primarily engaged. They're not engaged in that international trade world. They're engaged in the periphery of it. And they have their roots, the very good roots, and they can speak the language and deal with the Malays and the Dutch burghers and so on. So that's the world that they're building in. And then when more people come, so you can read the stories of, these various Hakkas who come, and they get sort of invited in. And so some of the early associations, they have an early cemetery. And the Chenghontang is sort of the manager of all that. And the famous case in the late 40s, early 1840s and 50s, when tin mining is soaring, and there's a lot of these immigrants, and the British messed up what they were doing with one of these Kongsi up in the Asahan area. And so they, they find out, oh gosh, those people have their own, they're trying to resist. And so they send the revenue collector up there, and they run them out of town with weapons and everything. So they're going to call on, we need more police. And so it's the Chinese community that intervenes and said, no, we'll talk to them, we'll solve it. And they solve it, I think, by a lot of negotiation that is designed to benefit both that community in Malacca and the immigrant communities that are doing active things. and because they both benefit from keeping the peace. And then there was a famous case as late as 1870 something, when everybody is praising these people, including Tan Tek Guan and Chan Tek Chang and these people, for being the ones who devised a method of keeping the peace between two warring associations. And they were, you say, two secret societies, right? And they devised something where part of the solution was they would agree not to fight, and that they would make some kind of peace between them. And if anybody broke the peace, they would have to give a huge donation to the local hospital. It just sounds, you know, like, oh, really? That's what we hear about it, right? That's what you see in the papers, and you see people arguing about what it is. But so that's my impression, an important part of how that worked. Does that partially answer? Yeah. We could talk more about it, I hope. Yes.
As an alumni of Peifeng, I will study there for my 6-year secondary school there. Maybe I have questions regarding on your research, and also based on my PhD research. I read a text written by a Chinese Kuomintang's general. He dropped up his places in different spots in the Peninsula Malaya. And once he compared the Chinese between the Malacca and other states of the peninsula, they says that he thought that the Chinese in Malacca reacted differently from the other state of the Chinese, which means they, unlike other state of the Chinese, they are very active in organizing some activities that related to what was undergoing in the China, like maybe some warfare or some of the, you know, kind of the activity. But in Malacca, they are just lack of this kind of enthusiasm to organize some activities that has some relations with the events that happen in China. So my question is, from your resources that you utilize in analyzing this, did the sources trying to alienate or differentiate or build an typical or specific identity of the Chinese of Malacca, regardless of the Peranakan, the Straits Chinese or the Chinese educated Chinese? Did the sources back in the early 20th century, from what you have seen, trying to shape a unique identity of Chinese in Malacca?
Well, that's a pretty complicated question. So I guess depends sort of on what, you know, what sources we're talking about. But Peifeng, now, so this is not the very early part of the century, but actually in the, you mean 20s, 30s, like that, right? Yeah. Well, of course, as you surely know, there was a Kuomintang chapter, or what do we call it? The one Kuomintang, what do we call them? The centers. There were like 8 of them in Malaysia, and Malacca had one, and it was very closely associated with activities in the you know, welfare community, medical. These were the Kuomintang members who were engaged in all these public activities there, and they also had sent, you know, they sent delegation to China in 29, I think, when they had this big, there was a big conference that the nationalist government was sponsoring for education abroad, and in what they're going to do in the diaspora, what the schools could do. And a lot of the input in that actually came from Malacca. So when Malacca saw itself as, I mean, the Peifeng school system So they were there. And other people who later came to Malacca were there at that meeting. What I felt that I could see is that the Malacca people were developing their own schools, and they're getting their library. They want to have a shared library, and they want to have shared world with other schools and things. But what they did was, they took their own ideas, and then when later the Chinese government came and said, they're sending orders down, they could just, in the same way, they could say, well, we got that. And when it was, and of course, as far as fundraising was concerned, they were fundraising all the time to send to China for, whatever it was. And so in this narrative, there's a lot about what kind of fundraising went on, because the Chinese community that is more, focused on what's happening in China, they're going to raise their money from the wealthy Chinese who maybe care less. But you can't care less at the time, in this particular time, in the 1930s, because nobody knows what's going to happen to the British. And nobody knows, and the arguments are going on with the British governor, who says, you people are all like minority sojourners in my pan-Malayan world. And so those arguments are going on. So the Chinese identity, I feel, in Malacca was more, again, coalescing around that. Nonetheless, you're going to have a lot of sort of wastrels there's a lot of wastrels in wealthy communities, and they're not going to be caring too much is what they spend their money on and stuff like that. I don't know if this helps, but we could certainly talk more about it. But that moment when they create the Sengchong Society, and Ho Ba-jin was one of the people that's doing that, and these are related to the nationalist government. You don't see they don't see much communist activity. When you get a little bit of communist activity out there, everybody wants it to go away. Yeah.
I think perhaps the figure He Baoren had a very specific characteristic compared with others figure. They are maybe Kuomintang affiliated or other figures in China that shaped how He Baoren's activity in Malacca has its significance. So this is what I want to comment on.
Thank you. That's a very long one, isn't it? Guandi Temple. Let's see. This might be a little bit too detailed to. Right. This is about a temple. I've spoiled it, have I? This is more informational, I think, for me, isn't it? Is there a question? It's a question, and thank you. I want to read this later, but I don't want to take the time. I think time might be running out anyway, but is there anything else? Did we miss something?
Any last questions?
Answer that like online.
Yeah, Prof say he can answer it online later. Okay, any burning questions from the audience online? Yeah, I think almost everyone here asked their questions. Okay, sure, Prof.
I'm just following what Prof. Danny has raised just now. I mean, the current issue that we are looking at in Penang, Singapore, and Malacca, through the new regeneration of revival tradition that is being done, precisely in Malacca, and then now is in Penang and Singapore, the connectivity. The issue that I'm asking is, I've heard so much in your presentation of the centrality of the Peranakan in many of this, you're looking at the artifacts, looking at the practices and so on. And then there's an issue of the larger Chinese. So what is a bit confusing for me is, I'm asking this question because I'm a bit confused, because your title says between heaven and earth, and then learning, faith, power, performance in the Chinese community of Malaysia. It's a 150-year span. Now, when I first read it, the title, it gives me an impression that is slightly different from what you have presented. So my question to you is, how and what you think would be your catchment area of readers of this text in Malaysia?
Who wants to read it, or anyone who has a question? See, that this is the question: who would want to read it? I'm thinking, well, a lot of people that I talk to want to read this or that or something else in it, and it's not directed. Well, look, I've been dealing with people who deal with Chinese diaspora quite a lot, and so I attend these things, I write these things, and there's discussions among people about how much local, how much is local. The term transnational comes up, right? I think, well, what is transnational? As soon as you're talking transnational, you're still talking nations, not communities. So in that area, the importance of this is to say, look, here is a community that was identified as Chinese. They were Chinese when the British came. This was the Chinese community. They called them Chinese, right? The whole thing about what's Baba Nonya is when you try to make them less Chinese, right? And yet they're the people who are dealing as a Chinese community at the beginning with the British. And they're the people who are actually pretty well integrated into the larger community, especially with the Dutch burghers and the other people who are like the movers and shakers in that business world and so on, where the money was. So by the late 19th century, there's this whole thing about how special the Baba Nonya culture is. But 100 years earlier, these were people who were adapting to a change in their environment, and they were labeled Chinese. And so they become the spokesmen for Chinese. And they're in Singapore. They turn to them because they can speak English, and they're doing very good business. They're Chinese, right? It's when you want to divide the Chinese into these categories of dialect groups, you're creating new kind of identities around those dialect groups. If you look in their villages and some Hakka communities, like in Malacca, I know Hakkas who say, we're this Hakka, not that Hakka, and they're all from the same county, and identifying 3 different Hakka identities from one county, you see. So you can go more local or more trans-local until you get to transnational. So is it like Chinese or Malay, Chinese or Malaysian? Or is it just can I just be who I am? And if we want to call ourselves Chinese, isn't that all right? Even if we don't speak the language. So this is that kind of thing that goes on in the overseas. It's why the journal that I publish it in is called Trans-Local Chinese East Asian Perspective. It's there's this struggle to try to identify people with communities rather than with the huge nation state of China, which is like saying
I just want to infer the situation with the Orientalists and non-Orientalists. The fear is that Well, we are talking now when scholarship in Malaysia with regards to Chinese diaspora and the Peranakan Baba and the reinvention of many identities. Currently, we have a lot of issues. This is the problem when you present this text. My question is that, is this text going to be the text that the local subsumes to the text, or the text is regarded to be a text that is telling us a story? You know why? When people go very far back, they go to a point. They don't go to everywhere. They go to a very particular point, and that particular point relates to the whole hierarchical lineages, practices, and historical trail. So because a lot is fantastic information. I'm just amazed with this information. You know, it's so huge. It's encyclopedic. But my problem now is to address as the readers. I mean, how would the reader come in? And then if one of particular points doesn't track the person into the points of reference, not trajectorying what the person is interested, it will turn the reader away. I mean, yes, it's like a Wikipedia. You can point something, it comes in pages. But I'm looking at the context of 150 years. That's the point of reference. 150 years has to be a benchmark, raison d'être for the discourse, because we are looking at the 21st century. And the 21st century people are asking all kinds of questions. I don't know whether I'm making sense. I'm just trying to figure out, you know, how you can push this publication to the point where it becomes a referral rather than becomes one of the readers. If you think it's going to be one of the readings or the readings, then it's okay. But I think you have so much information. I'm amazed at the information you have. I think it's better to put it together somewhere so the narratives become clearer rather than looking at the site, UNESCO, and Chinese Malaysian recent recognition of the ICH and going back. So the reinvention of thoughts and creation comes from that moment, the epilogue. Your epilogue to me just now reflects the bell. I was hearing the sound, but as I was walking towards the epilogue, I was confused.
Well, the epilogue, if this book doesn't get published for another year, the epilogue could be entirely different. And see, the point is, it's not, no, the book is not directed toward the epilogue. The epilogue is oh, look what happened this year, you know? And so the epilogue might just as well be focusing on what's up with the Zhongchen. I mean, that's the point. So it stops, the history stops in 45, and it's for anybody to wonder why it is worth it to have a history of Chinese community in Malacca during those years when British were the prevailing political influence at a high level. Because if you want to just do comparison, you could have, you know, this is something to compare to what's happened in the last 60 years. Because that, you know, there's that. And I mean, in the one paper I did, I called the Chinese in the penumbras of greater and lesser states, because it's how the power sort of system works in its hierarchies and how the state works with communities that is kind of a big part of the issue. That's what that era is. Colonial era over. Now, the next chapter is got to be somebody else. And in fact, this book is not intended to be, you know, it doesn't have to last. The reason I want it to be, I want it to have interactive index. I want it to be an interactive source for people who can go back and say, well, that's not right. Or I'm thinking this about it. I think I want to look, you know, it's serendipity. I can go to the newspapers and start asking other questions, and then I find out something else. And that's all this is supposed to be, is like to push something forward, and then after I'm gone, other people be doing something else with it. But there's nothing there right now, I think. That's it. Yeah. All right.
Thank you very much for your attention and attending. So, we will end here, and let us give a big clap